Hi everyone, hope you're all well. So I've read another case today in Sunderland. It's like kind of localized news, I guess I'm getting, of a burglar who had, wait for it, 85 previous convictions. 85 previous convictions. And he's been sentenced to 19 months in prison because, of course, he breached a suspended sentence. What he'd actually done was broken into secure accommodation with, I understand, was vulnerable adults and didn't use violence but stole one of the residents' wallets and has left that person feeling very vulnerable, obviously. Um, the thing that stands out for me with this, I should say there was also another aspect to the case, which is the judge who recalled him to prison. He hurled misogynistic abuse at her. And the judge in the new case, that is presiding over that case, highlighted that. And, um, the response was, well, we know that you've got drug problems and you've caused misery for others, but no doubt you've caused misery to yourself. And his lawyer said that he had remorse and etc., etc., etc. The problem is we've heard it so many times before. Now, to me, someone who has 85 previous convictions doesn't have remorse. There's clearly something very wrong there. And I think one of the problems with the way we approach suspended sentences in this country is if the offender breaches that suspended sentence, i.e., in the time that they are going through that suspended sentence, if they re-offend, they could be recalled back to prison. But then they'll get the original sentence, which is in cases of burglary and assault, for example, would be a custodial sentence. But what really I find absurd is being a career criminal in itself is not seen as an aggravating factor. In other words, an offender will be tried for an individual offence that they're accused of. And whilst I understand that, i.e., this is what this person's accused of, so that's what they're being tried for, I do strongly, strongly believe that if their criminal record was factored into sentencing, it would make a difference. I mean, let's say someone has 85 convictions for shoplifting. On the 85th occasion when they breached, dozens of suspended sentences that they've already got, or community sentences, shouldn't that be the point where the presiding judge says, okay, there's clearly a problem here, and yet our infuriatingly detached justice establishment, they will still give the same sentence. They won't increase the sentence because that person's been a career criminal. So this is something I think needs to desperately change. There's many things I think need to change in our justice system, but I would say a real focused targeting of career criminals would be a start. And it's also why it kind of makes a mockery of Lord Timpson's claim that we punish too many people in this country. That insinuates that we just throw people into prison on the first offence. It is absolutely not the case. And as prisons minister, he will know that. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but when he said that shortly after being appointed by Starmer in that role, I was disgusted by it. I thought it was tone deaf and plain wrong. Lord Timpson has got some credit for his work with ex-offenders in terms of he's of the Timpson family, which is famous for making keys, and it's a innovative family, I guess we could say, in the northwest of England. And I do give him credit for that, but I think that statement was a disgrace. We punish too many people in this country. I mean, what sort of message does Lord Timpson think that sends out to victims of crime? People who have seen their, the perpetrator given a suspended sentence, despite the anxiety, despite the pain that it's put them through. Despite what they claim, I believe the justice establishment continues to be detached. I think most judges are detached. Because if you look at their statements, they'll acknowledge the seriousness of a crime, and then they'll sort of talk as if they're being tough, and you look at it and it isn't tough. Judges do not think the way the public thinks. I don't care what they say, they are detached. And this may be because they're constantly in that legal world. They know, obviously they know the law. They know what their caseloads are. They know what the guidelines are. And I emphasize that word, guidelines. Judges also work with aggravating and mitigating factors. What I find infuriating is they don't take into account someone being a career criminal as an aggravating factor. Now, to me, that should be. Even if the new offence is not more serious than the previous offence, I would still consider being a career criminal in itself to be an aggravating factor. That's something that needs to change, and the fact that it isn't is why we have people who notch up dozens and dozens of offences and they still get suspended sentences. It's absolutely infuriating, and it's a stupid policy because it endangers the public. The Liberal left love to talk about why we need to focus on rehabilitation instead of punishment. They don't like the concept of punishment. That's an area I strongly, strongly differ from the Liberal left on. There's some positions I could be described as left-leaning, but when it comes to crime, no, that's something I strongly disagree on. And it's why I'm not in a rush to vote for any party. I mean, right now, if there were a general election tomorrow and someone said, Nathan, you need to vote for someone, it would probably be the Liberal Democrats, but I'm not overly enthusiastic about, I'm not. Their stance on crime, they are a left-wing party. They have left-wing views on crime. That's not something I agree with. So you might think, well, go for Reform then, because Reform has promised to be the toughest party ever on law and order. I'd like to believe that. I'd like to think if this party really is going to get into power, and we don't know what will happen, we just don't know. I think Reform is going through a lot of scrutiny right now, but let's say they do get into power. I would like to think they mean what they say, and they will be tough on crime, because there's something that it's just been this festering problem in this country. If you look at people involved in that legal world, they will say, but actually sentencing has increased in recent years, average sentencing, but it's too insignificant to make much of a difference to public opinion. We're talking something like, and don't quote me on this, but it's maybe 20-25% increase in sentences compared to 10 years ago. But when it was so lenient to begin with, that doesn't make much of a difference. So for instance, if, and again, this is not, it's just an example, it's not, meant to be taken as the norm across the board. But if you get, say, violent assault got 2 years, 10 years ago, then now it gets 2 years and 2 months. Okay, that isn't an exact example, but that's the sort of thing they're talking about when they say that sentencing has increased. It's insignificant. It's an insignificant difference. There's a couple of minor things that have improved. Televised verdicts are probably a good thing. It gives a bit more transparency, because judges actually aren't really accountable in this country to the public. They're accountable to each other, and a judge can be reprimanded if, for example, they're involved in professional misconduct. So, for example, if they mess around with a juror, or they they do something in the trial that can be considered professional misconduct. But there really is no accountability of judges who are consistently soft, to put it plainly. And in my view, this is not really democratic, because the public have no power on this at all. At all. Now, I want to be clear how I see this. I do not say that we should have mob justice. I don't say that every single judicial decision should be decided by the public, because obviously judges have the facts before them. They have the aggravating and mitigating factors. The jurors hear the details. And, I certainly wouldn't favour mob justice at all. It is important that there is due process. It is important to avoid miscarriages of justice. I totally understand that. But in this country, unlike the United States, judges are not elected. I'm not so sure that that's a wonderful system, because you get a situation where a judge who's consistently soft, the only way to hold them to account, really, and even this is really, really narrow. Anyone, I don't know if people realise this, anyone can write to the Attorney General of England and Wales and there'll be equivalent systems in Scotland, and I'm not sure about Northern Ireland, but you can write to the Attorney General basically to review a case if you believe it's unduly lenient. But here's the catch. The vast majority of cases are not overturned. If they are even heard by the Attorney General, sometimes they're not even heard. So the Court of Appeal, more often than not, upholds the original decision. Very, very occasionally they increase the sentence, but it is very rare. So that makes me wonder, what is the point of that? Is it, again, just kind of lip service to the public to say, oh, look, we are listening to you? I mean, I'm not convinced that our legal establishment is not detached. I believe strongly that it is. And I think the evidence shows that. You know, if you ask the public, what do you think of sentencing generally? Obviously, it's going to differ from crime to crime, but I think the general consensus would be dissatisfaction. This isn't across the board. There will be people, like I say, of liberal left persuasion. And by the way, in using those terms, I'm not being offensive. It's just the political, leanings. That's just the reality. People who are liberal left tend to take pro-leniency views on crime. That's not an insult. It's just what their position is. It's a position I strongly disagree with, but that's just an observation. It's not an insult. But anyway, I just think that there's enough dissatisfaction in our system to point to something being seriously wrong. Now, I do not say in every single case the verdict or the sentence is wrong. I look at some cases and I think, okay, that's about right. But there's enough cases out there to cause significant disillusion in the public. And the irony about the appeals process, that is to say, that the unduly lenient scheme, it was called, the whole idea of that was to try and restore public trust in the justice system. But when the Court of Appeal arrogantly ignores most of those appeals, then it's not fit for purpose. You know, if this scheme was set up to try and give the public some more sense of empowerment, and yet the Court of Appeal regularly ignores that, then it is they're clearly not listening, So going forward, am I saying we should elect every judge? Not necessarily, but I'd like to see a bit more scrutiny. If you put it this way, I'd make this comparison with parliamentarians. If you're unhappy with your MP, you can vote them out of office. You can write to their surgery. That is, a good MP should see their constituents on a regular basis. Some do, some don't. But the point is, there's an accountability there. People complain about politicians all the time, but you do have the power to vote them out of office. If you're unhappy about a soft judge, what can you do about it? Like I say, that undue leniency scheme, I don't think it's fit for purpose, because in the majority of cases, the Court of Appeal doesn't change the original verdict. They go with it. In other words, they're saying, oh, well, we agree with the judge, and just disregard what the public think. I don't think that justice should be about what the crowd says, but I also don't think that the public should be ignored. And frankly, right now, they are largely ignored. The Sentencing Council of England and Wales say that they have public consultations. But if you look at those consultations, it's not looking at every crime. It's certainly not looking at a lot of the crimes people feel very strongly about, such as youth crime, which causes a huge amount of misery, causes huge amounts of stress and anxiety from antisocial behaviour. They don't cover that. They don't cover a lot of crime, actually. So as far as I'm concerned, that's just kind of lip service. Say, oh, look, we are listening to you. But a consultation doesn't mean they're going to follow up on it. It doesn't mean they're going to actually listen to the public's feedback. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a way of kind of appeasing public sentiments. I do think the judges are detached, because when they say, for example, when they think that they're being tough, it's different from what the public expect. And again, I know I've cited this case a few times, but I think it's a good example. When a 16-year-old brought a machete to a public place in Liverpool, thankfully he didn't use it, but you don't bring a machete there for fun. That's a serious offence. Apparently he was displaying arrogance because of his age. And the judge said this. The judge actually said, you arrogantly think that you're above justice and so on. So there, myself and other readers say, okay, this is a judge that is actually in tune with public sentiment. What happens? Suspended sentence. Suspended sentence. You see, the whole point of suspended sentences is there's supposed to be another chance for the offender. Like they'll be on a sort of period whereby they're closely scrutinised, and if they re-offend, then they're brought straight back to prison or something. But I think they're hugely overused. I think it definitely erodes trust in the justice system because it looks like soft justice to most people. It may technically not be walking free from jail in the sense that there are some consequences, but again, it's like this thing with a life sentence. If someone is given a life sentence in this country, it doesn't really mean a life sentence. And what our arrogant justice establishment will say is, oh, but it is a life sentence because there's lifelong attachments to that, i.e. they will serve 12 years in jail and then for the rest of their life they have to meet a parole officer or something. But there is a contradiction in saying this person has got a life sentence. In the public mind, that should be a life sentence in jail. The only people who actually get that are those who get a whole life tariff, and that's extremely rare. It's really only used for serial killers and terrorists, and even then not in every case. So I don't say we have the worst justice system in the world. I do not say that every single case is the wrong judgment, but I do think that the justice establishment, which includes legislators, judges, and the sentencing council, I have said this so many times, I do believe they continue to be arrogantly detached from public opinion, despite what they claim. Because the truth is, if they really, really, really were listening to the public, we would be seeing a drastic change in sentencing. We would be seeing significantly increased sentences. We would be seeing career criminals immediately put into prison, because that would be the common sense thing. Clearly, and again, the liberal left talk all the time about rehabilitation and, let's have community sentences instead. They talk about prison failing. They never mention the fact that community sentencing also fails. You see, my issue with prison isn't the principle of prison. I think when it's done properly, prison can be a pragmatic approach. The problem we've got in prison these days is they're overcrowded, and that puts more pressure on staff, and it makes the offender obviously bitter. If you have a cell for 2 people and it's used by 5 people, obviously that's going to lead to tensions. I mean, anyone could see that. So instead of releasing more people, what Labour should be doing is building more prison space like they said they would in the campaign. When we hear of criminals getting released early and then going out and reoffending, it just infuriates the public. I have huge sympathy for prison staff. I think they are under enormous pressure. So to me, building more prisons isn't punitive. It's actually, it's practical, but you could look at it, if you're very much of the school of thought of rehabilitation before punishment, actually consider that for a second. Easing pressure on the system gives the offender more chance to rehabilitate anyway, because if they're in an environment which is less pressurizing, they're not cooped up in a cell with 3 other people. If they have less pressure, they have more of a chance of, sorting their life out and eventually being a better citizen. But releasing them early, just because the prisons are overcrowded, how the hell are they going to change their ways? I think that's nonsensical. And it infuriates the public and it scares the public. Because in some cases, the government was very quick to say we're not going to release anyone who are guilty of sexual offences or certain other violent crimes, but that doesn't mean that people being released are minor offenders. And another point, which contradicts the likes of Lord Timpson when they say we punish too many people, the vast majority of people in prison in this country are not like first-time shoplifters. I think it's extremely naive to think that there's anyone in prison in the UK who I've just done some minor thing. Yes, there is an issue around free speech online, but I think that if you're going to make threats online, you need to face consequences for that. It should be proportionate, but that isn't harmless. It isn't harmless when it directly puts people in danger. But all in all, like many people, I remain deeply, deeply frustrated with this system. I don't believe it's a system that protects the public. I believe that judges are a class unto themselves. I don't think they really live in the real world. This is not to say every judge is bad. I think some of them have good intentions. Probably most of them have good intentions. But I don't think they get it. I really, really, really don't see any evidence that judges understand public sentiments. Because if they did, they would do more than they're doing. They can say that their hands are tied. If that is really the case, then do something about it. They can use the power that they have to put pressure on the Sentencing Council. Give us some guidelines that we can work with. The Sentencing Council, for their part, they have to take responsibility. They're the ones giving those guidelines to judges. And legislators, for their part, need to increase the minimum tariffs. So the Sentencing Council will say, we're working within the framework legislators give us. But what we have here is a situation where it's kind of a blame game. Judges say their hands are tied. The Sentencing Council say they're just an advisory board. Legislators say they can't interfere in the judiciary. True as all of that may be, in each of those cases, they could do a hell of a lot more than they're doing to improve public trust. And as far as I'm concerned, they're failing. They're continuing to fail, and they've been failing for decades. And, in the end of the day, what I'm talking about, yes, I'm talking about some radical changes, but I'm not talking about anything unreasonable. I'm simply saying that people who hurt society have to pay for it. And that payment has to be proportionate to what they've done. If someone's committed a serious offence that has destroyed someone's life, they should not be getting a suspended sentence. That's a disgrace. And I think that's a very visible sort of sign of why so many people are frustrated with the justice system, because they see suspended sentences and they think, great, another criminal gets off with it. And whilst they may technically not be getting off because there's, strict attachments to that, you can't compare being in prison to having to report to a parole officer. It's not the same thing. So, I hope one day I won't have to keep talking about these things. I hope one day, we're never ever going to have a situation in a country of 70 million people where there will be no crime. Of course not. And I would admit that there's probably never going to be a system that pleases everyone. But I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that the tone-deaf system that we currently have can greatly improve if there was simply the willpower to do it. And that's the problem. That is the problem. I don't think that the Sentencing Council, I don't think that judges, and I don't think that legislators really, really have a willpower to start doing what the public wants. And finally, when I say what the public wants, I'm not talking about lynch mob justice. I'm simply talking about improving trust by increasing sentencing for serious crimes. We need to see that happening drastically. There's certain areas I particularly think of. Youth crime is a joke. There's no deterrent. Young offenders really are treated with cotton wool. It's not good enough. Dangerous drivers. Someone who is drink driving and they kill or seriously injure someone, yes, they should get a long custodial sentence, but they should never, never be allowed behind a wheel again. The current rationale is, well, they're allowed to drive again at some point because they might do it anyway. This is nonsensical, and it's infuriating. It's an insult to the victims. I can think of other things, reckless dog owners, these yobs who allow their dangerous dogs to just run wild. I would absolutely throw the book at them. I would take away the dog and I would definitely jail them for endangering the public. There are some cases where a custodial sentence isn't appropriate, where a community sentence makes more sense, but it has to be a strict community sentence and it has to really mean something. Otherwise, where's the deterrent? Because the liberal left love to say about how terrible prison is, and I'm sure some of them, if they had their way, they would totally abolish prison, which is insanely stupid. It's a minority, but I do think they're out there. I think there are some people who are just, they would do that. and I hope to God they're never in power. But anyway, yeah, they talk about how punitive prison is and how, oh, we just want to punish people. My challenge to them: can you honestly say that community sentencing works? Can you honestly say that when an offender has notched up so many sentences and they're not changing, then that is working? The non-custodial approach is working? Clearly it isn't. Can you seriously tell me that a 16-year-old who terrorizes society should be protected from, enjoy anonymity after they've convicted, when the government has just decided that 16-year-old can also vote? Does that make sense? So they're old enough to vote, but they're not old enough to be, named and shamed when they have been convicted. I'm not talking about the trial itself. I mean after the fact, when they've been convicted. I don't see why they should get to enjoy anonymity. So there's a lot of things in our justice system that can radically change. It's not the worst in the world. There's some parts of the world where people don't get any justice. Never mind soft justice, they don't get any justice because of corruption and because of other factors. Particularly in former dictatorships where people are still seeking justice for serious human rights abuses. That is, so that's not comparable to the UK, at least not on the same scale. And we also don't have a system that, in my view, is far, 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 far too lenient, i.e. the Nordic system. Because the liberal left love to talk about the Nordic system. Oh, look at the crime rates in Sweden and Norway. Well, let's look at them actually. Sweden now has a serious problem of gun crime and gang violence. So it's not the utopia that you make it out to be. Right, I'll wrap this up. But I don't want to sound like a broken record, but these are extremely important things because they affect quality of life. Crime is way, way at the top in terms of quality of life in a society, and our justice system is detached. It's not every single case, but it's too many cases. Shame on those who continue to ignore public opinion. Shame on those who continue to just arrogantly dismiss public anger. They are out of touch. They're letting the public down. They're letting the victims down. And with their leniency, they're actually endangering the public. Shame on them.